Tonight's topic is very, very timely because the national debt just passed the $30 trillion mark in the last month. So now it's time to introduce Loren, our speaker. Loren Spivack is the free market warrior. He was born and raised in Massachusetts and spent most of his adult life in New York City. Before becoming active in politics, he worked for several nonprofits and as a management consultant for both profit and nonprofit companies. He founded the Free Market Warrior in 2009 to teach conservative groups about free market economics. So far, he has presented to over 200 groups in 20 states. He is the author of a couple of parodies. One is called The New Democrat, which is a parody of the Obama administration, and it's in the style of The Cat in the Hat. His second book, The Gorax, spoofs Al Gore. He currently lives in Massachusetts with his wife and 3 of their 6 children who are still at home. We've had Loren speak to our groups here in Northern Virginia before, so you're in for a treat tonight. He is very funny and he knows his stuff. And so without further ado, I give you Loren Spivack. Loren, take it away.
Well, thank you. Great to be here with you guys. It's funny, I wasn't thinking about this, but I had to run out right before and get a few things, and I went across the street to the $1.25 tree. And it struck me that that was very relevant to our conversation tonight, because we want to talk about how the Dollar Tree became the $1.25 tree, and how before it's over, it may be the $1 trillion tree, which is actually kind of catchy. So maybe that'll turn out to be a good thing. But I speak to conservative groups all over the country about a number of issues related to free market economics. And one of the topics that's been coming up a lot lately is inflation, because supposedly our inflation rate is up to, I think it's 7.2%, and everyone says that that's the highest rate since 1982. But that's not quite the whole story. The fact is, in 1982, we calculated inflation differently. One of the factors you have to bring into this is the government's propensity to lie to us. So if we calculated inflation today the same way we calculated it in 1982, it wouldn't be 7%, it would be 15%. And at 15%, it's not just the highest since 82, it's higher than anything that happened in the 70s, and we're now talking about the level it was in the 1940s, and perhaps forever. Because before the 1940s, we didn't have inflation because we had currency that was based on precious metals, mostly gold and sometimes silver, and that prevented the inflation from happening at all. So one other introductory note I wanted to make was that the term inflation has literally changed its definition over these last 50 years. It used to refer to an increase in the money supply, which tended to lead to higher prices. Now, the dictionary definition of inflation is higher prices that are usually caused by an increase in the money supply. So the cause and the effect have kind of switched places in the definition. But what remains the same is that it's about ratios. If you have more of one thing and less of something else, their relative values are going to change. When the Spanish came to the New World 500 years ago, they were looking for gold, and they found it. They found lots and lots of gold and spent more than 100 years shipping the gold back to Spain. And they thought they were becoming rich. They actually went bankrupt because they didn't understand that as they increased the amount of gold in Europe, the value of gold went down. And that included not only the gold they were bringing back, but the gold they had before they came to the Americas. So they essentially bankrupted themselves by putting all that effort into bringing back gold, which made all the gold less valuable. So inflation can happen even in a context like that. The question that I've been asked frequently of late is what the difference is between inflation and hyperinflation. And I'll tell you, when I first heard that, I thought it was a silly question. It's like, what's the difference between a hot day and a really hot day? 93 degrees, it's kind of silly. Hyperinflation means more. But I've been thinking about it, And I read an article about the great inflation in the Weimar Republic of Germany in the 1920s. And the article I read was making the point that you get hyperinflation if you increase the money supply and decrease what's produced at the same time. They say usually you just print more money and that creates inflation, and that does work. But the article's point was that the hyperinflation comes when you burn the candle at both ends, and you not only make more money, you reduce what's being produced. So what happened in Weimar Germany is they were supposed to be paying reparations to the Allies, and they weren't paying them fast enough because they didn't have any money. And the French army invaded the industrial regions of Germany to force them to pay it. So they were forced to spend more money and print more money. And at the same time, they couldn't produce anything because the French army was in their way. So I think you'll notice this pattern here. You get really bad inflation. First of all, there's more, but you first of all get it because you burn the candle at both ends. More money and less stuff to buy. So the next point I want to go to is that of all the things I tell people, the one that I find people are most incredulous about is when I tell them that economics is not really about numbers. Everyone seems to think that economics is a subset of math, but it's not about numbers. There's nothing important in economics that you really need math to understand. It is a science about human beings, and it tells us how humans work both individually and even more important, collectively, and that's what economics is. So to really understand inflation and hyperinflation, we have to understand something that's very specifically human, and that is alcoholism. It is my belief that inflation is the alcoholism of the state. So let's take a minute and talk about alcoholism. How does it work? Because alcoholism is not a specific thing that happens to you once. It's a syndrome. You can go out tonight and drink all you want. That does not necessarily make you an alcoholic. An alcoholic is someone who is in a cycle where the problem and the solution to the problem appear to be the same thing. So if somebody is an alcoholic, bad things tend to happen to them. They may lose their job because they show up drunk. They get arrested for drunk driving. Maybe their wife leaves them because she doesn't want to be married to an alcoholic. All this bad stuff happens, and it causes pain. It hurts to have these bad things happen in your life. So what does the alcoholic do to deal with the pain that's caused by these bad things that were caused by the alcohol? And the answer is he drinks more alcohol. Where he gets his relief from the pain is to go back to the bar. And you could say the same thing about any other addiction. A compulsive gambler loses all his money, and what's his solution? He needs to go back to the casino to try to win it back. So he's going to, borrow money or steal money or whatever it is so he can go back to the casino again. The solution appears to the alcoholic to be the same thing that the problem is. Someone from outside easily sees the difference, but the alcoholic does not, and that's the nature of alcoholism. It's the alcoholism of the state that we're dealing with. So I want to also take a minute and talk about how bad our nation's alcohol. Actually, wait a second. I'm going slightly out of order here. Let me give you an example of the alcoholism in terms of the state itself. Prices are shooting up. Not 7%. They're shooting up. I said 15%. It may be more than that. The Dollar Tree has gone from $1 to $1.25. That's obviously 25%. One day we may wake up and find that food is really, really expensive because we've been burning the candle at both ends, and printing more money and getting in the way of our production of goods that we spend the money on. And you may get some riots. I presume you can picture this in your mind, that if people go to the store and a loaf of bread, instead of costing $2, costs $20, people are going to be rioting. They say, we can't afford the bread. We demand that the government do something about this. What do you think the government's going to do? I mean, yeah, they'll call out the National Guard and secure the streets or whatever, but what are they going to do to solve the problem? And I think we could all agree that they're going to say, we need more food stamps. $100 a week in food stamps worked when bread cost, $2, but now bread costs $20. We need to give people $1,000 a week in food stamps. And if we give that to them, they'll quit rioting and they'll go home and we'll have peace again. So the question is, where is the government going to get this money from to pay people more for food stamps? And the answer is they're going to print it. So this is the alcoholism of the state. The solution will turn out to be the problem. Okay, we got into this because we printed too much money, and we're going to print more money in a vain effort to get out of this. And in fact, our entire society is wrapped up in this alcoholism. Supposedly, the Federal Reserve is going to be raising interest rates. They talk about it much, much more than they actually do it because they really can't, because the minute they seriously raise interest rates, the stock market's going to crash. The stock market is an alcoholic too. It's addicted to this printed money that our government produces. So I want to take a minute now and give you a couple examples of how bad this is. And I'm not going to waste your time by just saying, our government wastes money on stupid things. There's books written about this. There's websites you can go to. I think we're past the stupid stage to the insane stage. And they're different. Stupid is spending all your money on a Ferrari when you can't afford it, and now you can't afford your rent or your food because you spent all your money on your Ferrari. I think we can agree that would be stupid. You know what insane is? If you drive the Ferrari off a cliff. Okay, that takes it from stupid to insane. So our government, our military, for example, spends way, way, way too much money on military equipment. There's some military gizmo that's made in some district of a powerful congressman. The generals don't even want it. We pay for it anyhow because our whole system has become corrupt this way, and we're all alcoholics. And then we just leave them all in Afghanistan and turn them over to the Taliban because we're too lazy to bring them back again, apparently. Okay, that's where we get to insane. So I'll give you another example. Up until very recently, the most expensive thing our government ever did was World War II. We spent about $3.7 trillion, and that's in current dollars. That's not in 1940s dollars. That's in today's dollars. 3.7 trillion over 3.5 years to beat the Germans and the Japanese and the Italians and win World War II. And up until very recently, that was the most expensive thing our government had ever done. But we've now surpassed it. We spent more than that on COVID. We spent almost $5 trillion. In 1 year on COVID. So it took 3.5 years for World War II, 1 year for COVID. And what did we pay for? We paid for everybody to stay home and do nothing. And if you're paying attention, you'll notice the point I brought up before, where first of all, we're printing all of this money. The national debt is a kind of a misnomer because it implies that we borrowed it from somebody. Nobody is stupid enough to buy government bonds anymore. This is all freshly printed money. The only entity that's buying government bonds in any reasonable quantity is the Federal Reserve, which is kind of sort of halfway a branch of government. So it's all printed. And we pay people to stay home and produce nothing. So the money supply is going up, and the amount that we're producing is going down. And this, as you may recall, is the first step toward hyperinflation. A couple more quick examples, if I may. I was noting the other day that last year in 2021, the Israelis and the Palestinians had a little kerfuffle with each other that lasted for a few weeks when the Palestinians shot rockets into Israel, and there was a whole big to-do over that. And I was asking why it was that when Trump was president, that didn't happen, because the Palestinians and Israelis have never gotten along with each other. Why didn't this happen when Trump was president? Why did it wait till Biden was president? And the answer is that Trump, when he got in there, cut off all U.S. funding to the Palestinians. When Biden became president, he restored the funding to the Palestinians specifically to help them deal with COVID. He gave them $100 million to deal with COVID. But there was a problem with that Biden didn't quite understand. And that is that the Palestinians are people who wrap their own children in dynamite and send them to blow up buses in Israel. Does that sound like people who are worried about COVID to you? Not really. So they took the money, but they didn't spend it on COVID. They spent it on rockets to shoot at Israel. Okay? And the Israelis have an anti-missile defense system which shoots down the rockets that we also paid for. So we paid for the Palestinians' rockets, and then we paid for the Israelis' anti-rocket rockets. And then after the Palestinians ran out of their rockets, the Israelis retaliated and bombed the Gaza Strip and blew up whatever they could blow up in the Gaza Strip with ordnance that we also paid for. And then when it was all over, we gave the Palestinians more money to rebuild the stuff that Israel had blown up with our money, and replaced the ordnance that Israel used to blow up the stuff in Israel. So you understand? We pay for both sides weapons, and then we pay to replace the destruction that both sides do with each other. If we were fighting World War II today, we would be sending money to the Japanese to reimburse them for the ordnance they used on Pearl Harbor, because our government is insane. And by the way, on the COVID, I left out one point on that. And not only did we pay, I think one of the craziest public policy decisions ever for everybody to stay home and do nothing, and we spent more money than World War II, we also paid for the disease. I mean, this is pretty clear now. A virus was created intentionally in a lab in China, which we paid for. That kind of experimentation, gain-of-function research, where you try to make diseases worse than they were originally, is illegal in the United States. So what did we do? We sent U.S. taxpayer money to China to pay them to do it, which again is something that we do all the time. There's no reason why we can't produce things in the United States as cheaply as they can produce them in China. But we have all these regulations in the United States, which makes the liberals happy that we have to do things, just so. But it makes American production too expensive. So we send it to China where they don't have any rules at all. And this is, again, is a pattern you'll see over and over again. When Biden came in, the first thing he did was shut down a lot of U.S. oil exploration. He stopped giving leases to drill on the land. He shut down the XL pipeline. When Trump left the White House, the United States, if you include Canada and Mexico, North America was energy independent. We did not need the Middle East, because in the Trump years, we produced so much energy, we were essentially self-sufficient, at least in North America. And then Biden shut it down. Why? Because the left is worried about global warming. They want less oil. And then the price of oil shot up, and Biden panicked because he's worried about the congressional elections later this year, and he called up OPEC to beg them to produce more oil so the price would go down. And you know what OPEC said? They said no. So the price of oil is shooting up higher and higher. And it begs the question, how does this prevent global warming? It's not like we're just not driving our cars. Instead of our producing it, we're just specifically asking the Saudi Arabians to produce it. But instead of stopping the oil production, we're just shifting to Saudi Arabia, which makes Americans poorer and makes the dollar even less valuable. And this goes on and on. We do the equivalent in our government of turning the heat up to 100 degrees, turning the air conditioner down to 40 degrees, and opening all the windows and doors at the same time. The Department of Agriculture pays farmers not to grow crops because some crazy economists back in the 30s thought that was good for the economy somehow to have less food. So food is deliberately made more expensive. And again, you'll see my motif here. More money. Where do we get the money to pay the farmers not to grow crops? We print it. And then we have fewer crops, okay? Production goes down, money production goes up. And then you get into a cycle where everyone's dependent on this freshly printed money. So the poor people can't afford the food in the grocery stores because our government pays the farmers to grow less food. And so what do? We make food stamps. We send the food stamps to the poor people who can't afford the food because the money we sent to the farmers paid them not to grow crops. This goes on and on and on. We are, as a society, as a government, as a country, are raging alcoholics. We're not only addicted to endless trillion-dollar deficits year after year after year, which is all printed. Well, it's all printed. Not only that, we've had $3 trillion crises in the last 20 years. From 2001 to today, we've had 3 crises on top of the regular budget, each of which cost multiple trillions of dollars. 9/11 was the first. The second one was the financial crisis of 2008, and the third one was COVID. In the 55 years preceding, from 1945 to 2000, we had $0 trillion crises. Now they seem to be coming once every 7 years. So, and this is on top of our institutionalized budget deficits. Okay, so this is why inflation is starting to get completely out of control. There's a few questions that people would logically ask me. I'm going to try to anticipate some of them, and you could ask me more later if you'd like. One is, why did it take this long for us to have this kind of inflation? And the answer is that the United States is in a unique position in world history because other countries have had crazy inflation. I mentioned Weimar Germany, Zimbabwe, Venezuela, but these were all countries kind of on the fringes. The United States has been the world predominant power for generations now. And I'm not aware of a case in history, maybe the Romans, where the predominant power in the world was destroying itself with this kind of inflation. And because we have historically been such a predominant power, our dollars get absorbed by other countries. Many countries around the world largely function on U.S. dollars. Panama doesn't even produce its own money. Their entire economy is U.S. dollars. For a while, Zimbabwe gave up their own money and were running their entire economy on U.S. dollars. Which is a smart thing for them. They had their own hyperinflation, so they just switched to U.S. dollars. Turkey is currently having a major financial crisis with massive inflation, and I was reading an article about how the wealthy in Turkey are handling this. They're buying everything with U.S. dollars. So the Turkish individual goes into a Turkish store in Turkey, and what's getting put down on the counter are dollars. People all over the world are living on U.S. dollars, which absorbs them from our production and makes inflation artificially low in the United States, uniquely, because of our unique situation. The problem is, this is going to cause the crash to be even worse. Because like the taller you are, the harder you fall. Because when inflation gets to a certain degree of badness, those dollars are going to all start flowing home. When people all over the world, literally more U.S. dollars are held overseas than are held in the United States. And when people overseas don't believe the dollar is retaining its value anymore, they're going to get rid of their dollars, and they're all going to come back to the United States because that's where dollars go to buy something, and if no one else wants them. And that is going to cause the crash when it happens to get even harder than it would happen in another country, because we're going to go from bad inflation to insanely bad inflation very, very quickly as soon as the dollars start coming home to roost. In the private market economy, if some branch of your corporation is losing money hand over fist, you stop it now, today. You don't phase it out over 20 years. Only government thinks like that. Why does government think like that? Because they're alcoholics. I don't know if any of you have ever dealt with a relative or a friend maybe who's an alcoholic, and you sit down with them and say, listen, we're really concerned about your alcoholism. You know, we love you and we want you to change. And he says, well, you know, I've been thinking about that. And I agree with you. I drink too much, and here's what I'm going to do. I am going to phase out my drinking over the next 20 years. Okay. See, right now I drink about 100 shots of whiskey a day, and I'm going to cut it down to 99, and then 98, and 20 years from now I'll be down to 0. But the immediate problem is that I'm out of scotch. So first thing I'm going to do is right now is I'm going to run to the liquor store and get a big bottle of scotch, and then I can begin my plan to phase out my drinking. Does that sound like someone who seriously is dealing with his alcoholism? I don't think so. And yet that's exactly what you're going to hear from practically anybody in government, that you bring up this conversation, that you bring up this topic, this concern for. So the question is there a solution? I mean, can we do something to avert this? And on one level, there absolutely is. In fact, it's a piece of cake. All we have to do is stop. All we have to do is stop printing money, stop spending money on insanity. The problem is the alcoholism, because everyone is hooked on this and telling, you know, so on one level, the alcoholic can simply stop drinking and we're fine. But, you know, anyone who's dealt with this knows it's way harder to achieve that than it is to say it. And most alcoholics don't start turning around until they hit rock bottom. And that is what I am very concerned that our country is going to have to do, is to hit rock bottom. How are we doing for time, Chris?
Did you want to leave time for questions, Loren?
Sure.
Okay, can you wrap up your main presentation then?
Yeah, sure. This is a good point. I'm happy to answer questions.
Okay. Now, I'm going to put Loren's email address on screen. Let me get that. There we go. Loren Spivack, the free market warrior, lorenspivack@gmail.com. And Loren, if you could tell people where they can get your books, and also tell them that your availability for speaking to groups. Go right ahead.
Sure. Well, I speak to conservative groups all over the country about many topics related to free market economics. Obviously, this was one of them. And I'm going to be touring the southeastern states for the next several months, say Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, Tennessee, that general area. So if anyone would like to talk with me about coming and speaking to your group, I would be happy to do that. I have written a number of books. Chris had mentioned a couple of them, but I write kind of humorous parodies pointing out issues facing our country today. My latest that just came out is called Motley Click. And it's based roughly on Moby Dick, and it's about a ship full of social justice warriors who are out hunting the great white racist, and they end up kind of catching each other because they keep finding these flaws in each other's wokeness. It is a very ironic story about how the anti-racists of today are really some of the most racist people you're ever going to meet. Anyhow, if you're interested in the books, or if you're interested in having me come and meet with your group, just drop me an email and we can talk.
Okay, let's go right into questions and answers. Let me get this. There we go. Let's see. One question is, can you comment on the likely impact of the huge asset holdings of the Federal Reserve?
Well, the Federal Reserve's asset holdings are U.S. government debt. I mean, it's not worth anything. The U.S. Treasury, and it's a misnomer. There's no treasure. Okay, I've said for years they should be called the debtory because there's no treasure. The U.S. Treasury prints government bonds, and the Federal Reserve prints dollars. And the Federal Reserve gives their dollars to the Treasury, and the Treasury gives their bonds to the Fed, and that's it. That's how we pay for things. It is laughable if it weren't so serious. So nobody's got anything that's worth anything. This is all a magic trick.
Here's a follow-up question on the Federal Reserve. The questioner says the Fed is a private corporation owned by global banks. The only link to our government is the appointment of the Fed chair and governors. This organization runs the government, not the other way. Do you have a comment?
Well, that's essentially true, and I'm a big fan of private enterprise, and I am a huge skeptic of the government. It's been my general conclusion that when you combine them, you get the worst of everything. That these combined government, non-governmental cooperations give you the worst results possible. It's a bad system and completely unnecessary. We got through the first couple hundred years of American history using either gold and silver or money that was specifically backed by gold and silver, and nothing was wrong. The Fed is a solution to a problem that didn't exist.
All right, the next question is, does anyone in Congress understand this? Could an amendment to the Constitution help, and what would the amendment say?
There are a couple people in Congress who understand it. Ron Paul, I guess, isn't there anymore. His son, Rand, is. There's a couple people who do, but it's a very short list. And, we can argue about, who are the more sincere or the less sincere. But realize this is so out of control, almost anything that would tip the balance the other way would be an improvement. I mean, we're going off a cliff at 1,000 miles an hour. Okay, so I'll take any improvement we could get. As far as a constitutional amendment, I could think of several. The goal of our founding fathers in making the Constitution was to keep the government in a box and say the government can do this and this and this, and that's all the government's supposed to do. And it worked for a long time. You got to give them credit for a couple hundred years. It did pretty much work. And then the government got out of the box, and we've been chasing it around ever since then. And we can't get it back into the box again. So we would need to seriously look. And it's fascinating how little this conversation actually happens. We need to seriously look and talk about what government really ought to be doing. Should they be making vaccine mandates and mask mandates, paying people to stay home, funding both sides at the same time of foreign wars, where they're fighting each other? What exactly should our government be doing? And if we shrunk it back to anywhere near the size that it was that our founding fathers envisioned, we would have no deficit or money printing problems at all. I also think, whenever you say something, whenever you talk about the gold standard, people say, well, what's so special about gold? There's nothing special about gold, except that nobody can produce it out of nothing. All gold does for us is it forces us to deal with reality because the gold supply is inherently limited. I mentioned one interesting historical case where the Spanish, because they came to the New World and discovered all this gold, kind of got out of that. But generally speaking, no one can really increase the gold supply, at least not substantially, and it keeps everybody in line. That's what it does. Fiat currency could be fine. There would be nothing wrong with fiat currency if the people who ran the system had the discipline to stop printing more money. But printing money is to a government like smoking crack is to an individual. You can say, well, I'm just going to do it once and I'm not going to do it anymore, but it doesn't really work out like that.
Okay, we have time for one more question. If the Republicans take back the House this fall and we have a Republican administration in 2025, will we do anything differently? Or will it just be not driving the Ferrari off the cliff anymore, but continuing to buy them? Does anyone in GOP politics today understand the threat of hyperinflation as you've described it?
Well, I wish I were more optimistic than I am. I mean, I do hope the Republicans take back power because I think they can stop some of the worst excesses of the Biden administration. But I got to tell you, I've been around for, I'm past the half-century mark now. I've seen a bunch of stuff. I voted for Ronald Reagan back in the 1980s because I wanted to shrink the government, but he didn't shrink the. He did some good things. I'm not, I'm happy that I voted for Reagan, but he did not shrink the government. He made business a little bit. And by the way, both Reagan and Trump helped the economy by reducing regulation on business. Neither of them did anything about government spending. And I've seen several other Republican presidents and Republican Congresses, and the fact that they're not even suggesting that they're going to do that when they get in there does not bode well. I do not see anything on the horizon that indicates that we're going to be able to tackle this alcoholic spending of ours, except that it can't continue. That at some point we're going to hit rock bottom and we're not going to be able to continue, even though we'll try.
Wasn't it an economist who said if something can't continue, it won't?
Probably.
Somebody said that. I forget who. Anyway, we have reached the end of the session of the hour of the formal agenda. So I want to thank you very much, Loren, for a fine presentation. Enjoyed it very much. Learned a lot. That'll do it for tonight, folks. Thanks for being here once again. Thanks, Loren. Great presentation. Really enjoyed having you. And
my pleasure.
All right. Hope to see you all again next month. Bye, everybody.